All right, so today we're gonna look at Cebu, the oldest city in the Philippines. All right, so how does this work out? Because who says it's the oldest? Well, it's because the Spaniards came here and officially declared it a city before they declared Manila a city or any of the other cities. They did exist, yes, they did. But according to the Spanish, they were not cities in the Spanish Empire yet. So this is actually the oldest Spanish city in the Philippines. So are you guys ready to take a look at Cebu?
This is the Philippines, an archipelago comprising of over 7,500 islands,
Yeah.
a fluctuating number mostly dependent on the height of the tide. Almost smack in the middle of this cluster is the island and city of Cebu. Its
Correct.
2021 population is estimated to be just short of 1 million people.
Really? Just only 1 million people? Well, it seems like there's a lot more people when you go to Cebu. I was just there before the lockdown, of course, for Christmas. And it seemed like a lot more people than 1 million. But you know, the way they count is different. So I don't know how they came up with that figure.
Making it the third most populous city in the Philippines.
The
Historically,
third?
it also happens to be the first settlement established by
Right.
the Spanish, and as a result, it is the oldest city in
Wow, I see SM Cebu seaside over there with the tower. It's so iconic, right? And the new road you see there going over to the seaside. Right, a lot of developments are happening in Cebu, right? Because I remember the first time I was in Cebu, which was way back in 1994. It was a very provincial town, very small. You could easily get around, you know. Cebu Airport on Mactan Island is actually one of the most beautiful airports I've seen in a really, really long time. And I understand it's one of the best airports in the entire world. So that's a great accomplishment for Cebu. And there's so many direct international flights going to Cebu right now. So you don't really have to go to Manila to go to the provinces. You can fly straight into Cebu and then go around.
the country, which also means that it is considered by many to be the birthplace of Christianity in
Right.
the Far East.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, this arrival of Spanish settlers also created conflict. It was right here on Mactan Island, just beside where the modern city of Cebu lies, that
Right.
arguably the most triumphant moment of early Filipino history occurred, creating the legend known as Lapu-Lapu.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. What were the pivotal moments of this region's recorded history? How was it affected by the arrival of the Spanish Empire? And how has Cebu evolved to become one of the most important economic centers in the Philippines?
Well, Cebu is becoming more and more important day for day. There's so many new projects popping up in Cebu. It's unbelievable. Some of them are amazingly beautiful. You can see my previous videos here on the channel. The projects like Sentosa Island of the Philippines, Dolphin Island is just incredible, amazing. Of course, Cebu being in Visayas region, it's basically the center of all commerce and industrialization for the Visayas region. No?
In truth, history of the earliest tribes living in the Philippines isn't that well known prior to the arrival of the Spanish,
Right.
simply because little was written down. What
Correct.
we do know largely comes from other Asian cultures who were their trade partners and settled there themselves, starting with the period of South Indian Pallava dynasty and the North Indian Gupta Empire, when Indian culture spread to Southeast Asia and reached as far as the Philippines, leading to the establishment of Indianized kingdoms.
We can also see the influence of the Hindus and the Indians with their Buddhism in places like Vietnam and Cambodia. Of course, in Bali, where there still are Hindus until now, no? So this is really exciting. We don't really hear much about the Hindus in the history of the Philippines from pre-Spanish times. It's kind of been erased from the records.
The date inscribed in the oldest Philippine document found is from 900 AD. Terms
Right.
and titles seen on this document show that the culture and society of Manila Bay was that of a Hindu and Old Malay
Oh,
mix,
you see?
similar to the cultures of Java, Malaysia, and Sumatra at the
Right.
time.
An Indianized society sprung up in Cebu when a man named Sri Lumay established his own rajahnat. He had
Oh.
been sent from Sumatra, Indonesia, to
Okay.
establish a base and subdue the local kingdoms. But he essentially went rogue and started his own society.
It is commonly argued that there was little evidence that the Philippines experienced much violence or competition amongst its tribes prior to the 14th century. This is in order to create a narrative aimed at the evils of early colonialism. It is more likely that participation in warfare was the most public and prestigious act in this prehistoric society, giving males the possibility of improving their social status. Like everywhere else, participation in warfare was desirable because of potential rewards, slaves, materials, bounty, and especially validation and prestige. But
Yeah, I think that's all over the world. I mean, it's always been like this. So the Spaniards trying to portray the Philippines as not having wars or in the pre-Spanish times, this is kind of ridiculous because we know from, the way the Filipinos lived before. Well, we know just from the saga of Lapu-Lapu, right, that there were a lot of fights going on between different islands or different tribes in the Philippines before. So definitely war was something very, very important in the Philippines, just like in Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding countries.
In the 1300s, a number of large coastal settlements had emerged as trading centers and became the focal points of societal changes. This phase of history can be noted for its highly mobile nature, with barangays transforming from being settlements and turning into fleets, and participating in land and sea raids was an essential part of the duties. These
Wow, so there's really a lot of history that we don't usually hear about. I mean, not just from Cebu, but from the entire Philippines, no? With the Rajanates and all that, the only thing that we mostly hear about is the Raja of Manila and the Raja Suleiman, also in Manila, of course. So, do you actually learn about this in school, or are you just starting from the time the Spanish arrived? Or are you also learning about what happened in the Philippines before, like in pre-Spanish times? I'm really excited to know about this. So, leave me a comment below and tell me, what do you learn in school about the history of the Philippines?
raids, locally known as Pangangayao, were usually regular annual expeditions undertaken by whole communities in the very Viking-like fashion.
Okay.
Massive changes to the region began with European arrival. While a settlement has existed on the island for many thousands of years, the city now known as Cebu was officially founded in 1565 by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi with the arrival of Spanish settlers. And the first recorded visit by Europeans came in the form of Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, which landed in Homonhon Island on March 17, 1521. This was followed by Magellan's insane voyage all the way from western Spain to southern tip of South America, all the way to the Philippines.
Incredible.
The goal was to find a new, shorter trade route to link Europe to Asia. So not long after arriving in the Philippines, Magellan was welcomed by the king of Cebu, Raja Humabon, along with his wife and around 700 of their native islanders. They did not lose any time and started baptizing the local population quickly after they gained favor from the king, who, according to a story, had an ill grandson. Magellan or one of his men was able to cure or help the young boy.
Oh, so that's why they converted to Christianity, because they saved the son of the king of Cebu. Okay, now I get it.
While it is likely that knowledge of Christianity had spread deep into the Far East, this was certainly the first time in history of the Philippines that large numbers of natives were evangelized into the church, meaning that Cebu really could have been one of the earliest bastions of Christianity in East Asia, especially since it was able to spread freely without much persecution, unlike in Japan, where it was outright forbidden, and it didn't really have much competition from the local beliefs, like in Mindanao, where Islam was much more established. But back to Magellan. So on that same expedition, Magellan and his crew tried to land on Mactan Island, some 6 kilometers east of Cebu. They were not given the same acceptance there, especially from Lapu-Lapu, the local chieftain.
When mention is made of the Spanish conquest of the Philippines, the first event that inevitably comes to mind is the Battle of Mactan. Every Filipino schoolchild would know of this story and be taught about it. It has been etched into Filipino nationalist consciousness, and Lapu-Lapu is considered a national hero.
Instead,
That's true, no? That's basically all we ever hear about is the story of Lapu-Lapu and how he killed Magellan, no? So that's really one of the things that Filipino kids are learning in school. What other things are you learning? I mean, is this really the only thing that we know from the pre-Spanish things? Have the Spanish really erased the story or the history of the Filipino people from before they arrived? Because it kind of seems like it to me.
Filipino nationalist consciousness, and Lapu-Lapu is considered a national hero.
Instead of a warm welcome, the Spaniards were met with a barrage of flying spears, and subsequently the Battle of Mactan was fought on April 27, 1521. Magellan was heavily outnumbered with only 100 soldiers or less, fighting Lapu-Lapu head-on in typical European fashion, utilizing his advanced weaponry. Considering that under Lapu-Lapu's commands there may have been well over 1,000 warriors, this probably at first seems like an obvious foolhardy blunder. In reality, Magellan by this point in his career was an experienced military leader who had faced similar odds when fighting various tribes in South America, including the Aztecs. Technological and tactically advanced methods of European fighting usually prevailed as they scared off local resistance, especially due to European tradition of warfare, which emphasized very direct confrontation that usually resulted in many casualties. This time they did not, and Magellan and most of his soldiers were overwhelmed and killed. Magellan's body was never recovered, and the remaining members of his expedition returned to Spain. Ever since, Lapu-Lapu became a national hero, symbolizing the nation's bravery and capability of resisting foreign invaders. Today, there are two monuments standing close to each other on Mactan Island, one in the name of the first national Philippine hero, and one for Magellan, the first bringer of Christianity.
Right.
So the story of Spanish colonization continues, as on April 27, 1565, another set of Spanish conquistadors, led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, arrived in Cebu. Raja Tupas was the chieftain of Cebu at the time, and he was not as easily swayed as the previous one. He was defeated, and as a result, he became the last Raja of Cebu, drawing to an end the history of Indianized society.
Tupas and Legazpi signed the Treaty of Cebu, which effectively gave Spain control over it. The Spaniards then constructed fortified settlements, with the main one being called Villa del Santísimo Nombre de Jes, and also Fort San Pedro, a military fortification in East Cebu City.
Oh, I love the Fort San Pedro. I visited that about 2 years ago. It's a beautiful place. It's a bit smaller than I expected. I thought it was going to be a very big fortress or something. So much smaller than you actually expected. But then again, they did not really have that many Spanish conquistadors at that time, because they only had how many ships arriving, and Spain was really, really far away. So they had to convince the local people by other means to support them.
In East Cebu City to defend the Spanish settlement from attacks by natives opposed to the colonization. Agriculture, trade, and commerce flourished in Cebu as it grew, and its population increased over the centuries as the Spaniards continued their colonization of the Philippines. The fragmented and sparsely populated nature of the islands made it easy for Spanish colonizations. The Spanish brought political unification through conquest of the various small maritime states. One of Spain's main objectives was the conversion of the local population to Roman Catholicism. The work of conversion was not that difficult, mostly thanks to the disunity of the religions that were existing.
Yeah, that's true, no? Because there were so many different religions, so many different islands, so it was not like one unified country that the Spaniards took over. Like in most other places, basically, there were like one country, like one unity. But because the Philippines is made up of so many islands, there's so many different beliefs, there's so many different chieftains, right? So it was a very different way of conquering the country for the Spaniards. And of course, much easier to convert the people into Christianity.
Maritime states. One of Spain's main objectives was the conversion of the local population to Roman Catholicism. The work of conversion was not that difficult, mostly thanks to the disunity of the religions that were existing, with the exception of Islam, which was still predominant in the southwest. Over the centuries, Spain never made any profit from ownership of the Philippines.
Oh, really?
In fact, it was a massive burden, made worse by wars and famine, but it could not withdraw because of perceived obligation to spread Christianity in East Asia.
Okay.
Initially, slavery was widespread in the Philippines, either between tribes or with early Spanish settlers as well. But this was mostly the case only before the archipelago was integrated into the Spanish Empire, because the Spanish actually established anti-slavery laws in the Americas. And they also extended it to the Philippines. This did not, however, eliminate slavery completely, especially since no laws were made to prohibit slave ownership amongst Filipinos themselves, but it did reduce it considerably.
Overall, Cebu prospered, and new communities began to develop, and the economy grew. Spanish colonialism in the Philippines wasn't actually that bad for the locals, whose standard of living was most definitely improved over the next 3 centuries. The governmental and administrative agencies introduced by Spain had considerable effect in welding the Filipinos into one entity. Numerous barangays, constantly at war with each other, became part of one single united colony. This led up to the Philippine Revolution. During the 19th century, an educated Filipino middle class emerged, and it had a desire for Philippine independence. Opposition before 1872 was primarily confined to the Filipino clergy, who resented the Spanish monopoly of power within the Roman Catholic Church. The real cause of the Philippine Revolt was the political maturation and national awakening of its people, and of course propaganda portraying Spain as a massively abusive empire. So in 1896, the war for independence against Spanish occupation began.
When the Spanish authorities discovered Katipunan, led by Andres Bonifacio, who openly declared a nationwide armed revolution.
And on April 3rd, 1898, the Cebuano revolutionary soldiers evicted the Spanish forces from the city in the Battle of Tres de Abril.
Really? They did, huh? This is something we don't really hear much about. maybe it's because I'm here in Manila, but they actually evicted the Spaniards. I'm surprised at that.
The local revolutionaries rose up against the Spanish colonial authorities and took control of the urban center after 3 days of fighting.
Nice.
Leon Quilat was betrayed and killed by one of his own men, and the
Aye.
rebels ended up withdrawing a few weeks later. By June, the island of Luzon, with the exception of Manila, was under Filipino control.
Really?
The first Filipino flag was again unfurled, and the national anthem was played for the first time alongside the establishment of the first Philippine Republic
Right.
and its revolutionary government. This success wasn't just attributable to the work of Filipino revolutionaries, however, as at the time Spain was also at war with Americans, who managed a major victory in the Battle of Manila, during which they blockaded and captured the capital. The Philippines would not have its real independence yet, however, as on February 4th, 1899, hostilities between Filipino and American forces began, when an American sentry patrolling between Filipino and American lines shot a Filipino soldier. The
Oh.
Filipino forces returned fire and ignited the Second Battle of Manila.
Okay, so that's how it started officially, huh? But it's also funny how the Americans really were set on taking the Philippines for themselves. Of course, they bought it from Spain officially, but still, I mean, the Filipinos were fighting for their independence and freedom from Spain, and here comes a completely different nation and basically took over the Philippines in the middle of the war, where they had actually been supportive of the Filipino independence movement. So kind of a little bit funny story there, huh?
The Philippines declared war against the United States on June 2nd,
course.
1899, with Pedro Paterno, President of the Congress of the First Philippine Republic, issuing a proclamation of war.
Oh, okay.
So from 1899 to 1902, the war between Filipino revolutionaries and the United States occurred, resulting in the American colonization of the entire country. Americans who were in favor of annexation had a variety of motivations: desire for commercial opportunities in Asia, concern that the Filipinos were incapable of self-rule, and fear that if the United States did not take control of the islands, another power, such as Germany or Japan,
Yeah.
might do so instead. And so, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Spanish-American War, provided for the secession of Cebu along with the rest of the Philippines to the United States.
So it was actually very selfish reasons that the U.S. took over the Philippines. It was for their protection of their west coast, basically, because they didn't want a foreign power like Germany or somebody else to take over the Philippines, and from there they could easily launch an attack on the west coast of America, no, of the US. So it's very selfish reasons, basically, that started this whole thing.
Cebu grew and expanded throughout the American colonial era as the Americans improved and established modern public infrastructure, such as highways, bridges, public services, and ports, as well as developing the educational system. In
Oh, that's good.
1936, Cebu, having officially been a town since its inception, became a city. In December 1932, the U.S. Congress started moving towards giving the Philippines independence,
Right.
leading to the creation and passing of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, otherwise known as the Philippine Independence Act, which allowed the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines with a 10-year period of peaceful transition to full independence. So the new Filipino government embarked on an ambitious nation-building policies in preparation for economic and political independence. Their plans would have to be paused for a while, however.
Yeah, that was sad. They were already, everything was underway, everything was going good, and well, America did a lot of good things. I mean, they improved the education system in the Philippines, right? They established a lot of companies, businesses here. So they did a lot of good things. They planned a lot of cities much better than they were. And we can see the result of it today. Then unfortunately came World War II, which destroyed especially Manila, no?
On December 8, 1941, the Japanese launched their invasion by sea from the island of Formosa, otherwise known as Taiwan, and the island of Palau. The defending forces significantly outnumbered the Japanese, but were a mixed force of non-combat and semi-experienced soldiers, while the Japanese used their first-line troops, and by concentrating their forces, they swiftly overran most of Luzon during the first month.
Okay.
Cebu City became an important base for the Japanese during the war,
Oh,
and as a
really?
result, it was subject to aerial bombardment by U.S. forces, resulting in widespread damage. Prior to the
Talaga?
war, Cebu had been the Philippines' second most important industrial center, and it offered the Allies a harbor for future operations against the Japanese, making it an important strategic target. This led to the Battle of Cebu City. The whole island was garrisoned by a force between 14,500 and 15,000 Japanese troops, mainly
That's a lot.
situated in Cebu City and on the central east coast. Following
Okay.
preliminary bombardment, the battle began on March 26, 1945, when the Allies launched Operation Victor II. under the leadership of Major General William H. Arnold. The force consisted of about 5,000 men who landed on Talisay Beach, 4 miles southwest of Cebu City.
Yeah, right. Well, Talisay, we've absolutely heard about the landing there. We rarely hear about the war in Cebu, I think. I don't know, again, if it's because I'm here in Manila or what, but we always hear about the war, how it affected Manila, the city of Manila, this area. But Cebu, we don't hear much about it, but it seems to me that there was a lot more going on in Cebu than most people realize, no? And it was a much more important city than most people think it was, because exactly the Allied forces could use this as a base of operation against the Japanese.
Meeting no Japanese opposition, the US forces nevertheless suffered heavily from mines and booby traps as they crossed the beach. The troops slowly forced its way off the beach and moved inland against only small pockets of Japanese resistance that were carrying out delaying actions.
First organized enemy resistance is encountered on the outskirts of Pardo, a village 2 miles from Cebu City.
The city itself was not that heavily defended either, as large parts of the Japanese force had withdrawn to hilly and more defensive terrain in the north of the city. During the final stages of the battle, the mountainous parts of Cebu were also bombed and cleared. A series of battles were subsequently fought during this time, the most famous of which was the Battle of Gochan Hill. It took about 2 months to fully liberate Cebu between March and April 1945. Cebu recovered after the war and grew and developed into a major economic center. Cebu's success as a sea hub also contributed to its emergence as an air transportation hub. During the Vietnam War, the US upgraded Mactan Island's airstrip to enable it to handle military jets.
Wow, okay, I had no idea. So even during the Vietnam War, the Americans were using Cebu. I didn't know that. So how many of you guys knew that? I bet you a lot of you didn't know.
When the war ended, Cebu was left with the makings of an international class airport, which has been expanded since then. Cebu became the second most significant metropolitan center in the country after the capital of Manila, recognized as the Philippines' main domestic shipping port and home to about 80% of the country's domestic shipping companies. The city was never rich in any particular resources and isn't endowed with much arable land, so it had to follow a model that was similar to Singapore and Hong Kong, largely relying on trade. As is often the case, independence from any single crop or resource fosters a flexible economy, one that is not at the mercy of bad weather or iron ore prices, for example. Of course, trade isn't the only reason why the city has prospered. Tourism is huge in the Philippines, and Cebu isn't an exception here.
Yeah, Cebu is really a major center for tourism in the Philippines, especially because there's so many islands down there. There's so many places you can go swimming. There are so many resorts, you know, that it's all really closer to Cebu than it is to Manila. And with an international airport in Cebu, then why would you fly to Manila first and then transfer to Cebu? There's no point in doing that. You might as well go straight to Cebu, diba?
Strategically situated in the heart of the Philippines, Cebu is very close to the country's biggest tourist spots. It attracts about 2 million tourists every year because of its location, economy, rich culture, pristine beaches, and the availability of diverse food. Cebu's business leaders are optimistic about the city's growth, with the tourism industry leading the way, along with development in IT and real estate sectors, with many multi-billion-dollar projects to come. So in a sense, Cebu is a city with an excellent model for growth that other cities in the Philippines should and could follow.
So there you go, the story of Cebu, and a quick overview of the Philippines. I learned a lot doing this video, and I don't know why I kept putting it off. I didn't expect to find such a deep well of interesting history that I haven't looked into.
Whoa, he's really done a lot of research about the Philippines and especially Cebu. I was actually pretty amazed because there was quite a few things that I did not know about, like how important Cebu was during the Second World War and how the Americans upgraded the airport in Cebu during the Vietnam War. I had no idea about that. Okay, so definitely Cebu is going to be a major hub in the Philippines in the future. I mean, there's so many new developments happening in the Philippines and especially in Cebu. So I'm actually very excited to see Cebu in about 5 to 10 years from now because it will be so developed. It will be such a different place from what it is today with all these new projects. And by the way, on my channel, you can find a reaction to some of the other projects which are ongoing right now in Cebu. So take a look at them if you have time. They're great. There are so many of them. There are billions and billions of dollars are being poured into Cebu City right now. It's incredible. All right, so as always, guys, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you like the video, give it a big thumbs up, okay? So I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.